world's spotlight is on Brazil, football the popular obsession. But here there's now a new fascination with the past and the decades of military dictatorship. We've come to Rio to find out more about the forgotten, dark side of Brazil and the part Britain played in it. A military coup overthrew Brazil's democratically elected left-wing government in 1964. The US and Britain supported it. The fear was of Soviet expansion after Cuba's communist revolution. There followed 21 years of dictatorship. We found compelling evidence that Britain not only welcomed the regime, but actively collaborated with the generals. Torture was the generals' main tool of repression. This, a simulation by a group called the Young People's Popular Uprising. They're now tracking down the torturers and publicly shaming them. Hundreds died or disappeared during military rule. Some were armed guerrillas, but many were young students, union leaders or journalists. Most of the political prisoners were subjected to extreme physical violence before they were killed. But from the early 1970s, things changed. Survivors speak of a new form of psychological torture, a method that came to be called the English system. The hub of the regime's torture apparatus was built in the centre of Rio, inside the headquarters of the military police.
This was where you were kept, this was where you were?
Yeah.
Alvaro Caldas was a journalist and member of a militant group. He was brought here, severely beaten and tortured with electric shocks. 3 years later, he had given up politics, but still he was rearrested and brought back.
I was in the same place, but I noticed there were marked differences. The air conditioning was very cold, and the smell made me feel really sick. The light was on permanently, and there was this sound which alternated loud and soft. When I was questioned, I always had to wear a hood. I had effectively been disappeared. All this psychological pressure to destabilize me. I couldn't sleep. I didn't know if it was day or night. It's a very powerful way of messing with someone's personality. I was only there a week. If I had been there for 2 weeks or a month, I would have gone mad.
This frail old man was once a notorious torturer. Colonel Paulo Malhães came to give evidence to Brazil's Truth Commission, unrepentant for his record of killing and mutilation of victims. He said in an audio deposition the special cell in Rio was based on an idea learnt in the UK.
Aquelas prisões do DOI serem de porta, fechado, você poder modificar o calor, a luz, tudo dentro da prisão, aquilo veio da Inglaterra.
We found out that in a private conversation with the prosecutor, the colonel admitted he himself had been to Britain. Soon afterwards, Colonel Malhães was killed in a suspicious burglary at his home. Buried with him are the details of exactly what he learnt. It's likely to have been the controversial stress techniques honed against IRA prisoners. So what other evidence is there that the British trained agents of the Brazilian military? Well, we've come to see a man who actually interviewed many of the highest-ranking generals while they were still alive. Are you convinced from your interviews that there was collaboration between the British and the Brazilian army?
Definitely. Why would they mention this?
But why were they looking abroad to learn how to interrogate people?
My guess, based on what I've read, what I heard, is that their simple brute techniques were not working.
In the professor's book, several generals told him they'd sent officers to London. One said, "The Americans teach, but the English are the masters in teaching how to wrench confessions under pressure by torture in all ways. England is the model of democracy, They give courses for their friends. The head of the Rio Truth Commission is under pressure to unearth more about the past. Brazilians have long known America paid for and taught repression. It's been a revelation here that Britain was also involved.
Sempre causa choque, né? Saber que uma democracia.
It is always shocking to hear that a democracy which is so important, so established, so old, collaborated with a dictatorship.
We then tracked down a former leader of a police death squad. He couldn't come to Rio because of threats to his life. It's alleged Claudio Guerra killed up to 100 people. Now he's found God and works as a Christian pastor. He says he met British agents who were teaching interrogation techniques in Brazil.
Eu tive contato com dois agentes, em São Paulo.
I had contacts with two, one in São Paulo and one in Rio. The one in Rio stayed at the Copacabana Palace.
Esse do Rio ele ficava hospedado no hotel Copacabana Palace.
How did you know they were English agents? They could have been Americans.
Porque tinha os agentes norte-americanos da CIA que a gente já sabia quem é.
Because we knew the North American agents from the CIA. The Americans spoke Spanish. They were all Cubans. They looked like Latin Americans, but the English were very different. So you could tell they were not Americans.
Quando havia os ensinamentos.
And when they were teaching, they said the techniques were used in Ireland and had given good results.
Deram bons resultados.
Britain's interrogation methods were widely admired, and it's known from documents in the National Archives in Kew that they were also exported to allies. We've discovered evidence that Brazil was one of them. So this is a secret file. There are tantalising references to Brazil adopting acceptable standards of interrogation of the kind permitted in Northern Ireland, or the commander of the First Army in Rio describing the new techniques as taking a leaf out of the British book. Then we found this 1972 letter from the British ambassador, marked secret. There's a reference to the adoption by the Brazilians of more sophisticated methods of interrogation. As you know, I think they have in the past been influenced by suggestions and advice emanating from us.
And it came out of Kew, this?
It came out of Kew, in the confidential letter on torture, which I have sent by this. Sir Alan Munro was a diplomat in Brazil just afterwards. We showed him the ambassador's letter. He said he personally had no knowledge of British collaboration.
If the Brazilians were looking at techniques, if you like, of interrogation used by British authorities, and the example, I suppose, here would have been the early years of the troubles in Northern Ireland, well, this would have been undertaken, I would say, under some Brazilian initiative of inquiry, and to the extent that it might help to reduce the most brutal methods which had in some cases been employed, well then it would be a step in the right direction.
But for these young protesters, the idea that Britain helped train the torturers was not a step in the right direction. It was another foreign government colluding with the oppressive regime, a regime which still hasn't faced justice.